Today, we're diving straight into some really thought-provoking stuff. It's based on the Abstractionist papers by Luiz von Paumgartten.
Hmm.
And you can actually grab that for free over at welcometothe.bluespace.com. So the topic today is, well, it sounds simple.
Mhm.
What are things and processes? But maybe
Yeah.
it's not so simple.
Right. I
Yeah.
think we all feel like we have a pretty solid, intuitive grasp on that difference.
A chair is a thing, walking is a process.
Hmm.
Seems clear enough.
Exactly. That's the conventional view, pretty much baked into how we talk and even how a lot of science and philosophy works. You have these stable objects, entities, things.
Like a rock or, I don't know, an electron maybe?
Sure. And then you have the processes,
Uh-huh.
the actions, the changes over time, like erosion acting on the rock or the electron interacting with a field.
Okay, so that's the baseline. How do the Abstractionist papers shake that up?
Well, they shake it up quite a bit. The core idea, and it's a big one, is that fundamentally everything is a process.
Whoa, hold on. Everything, even like this solid table right here, that's a process.
According to this perspective, yes. What we perceive as a static thing, like the table, is actually a highly complex pattern of ongoing interactions. A dynamic equilibrium, you could say?
So the particle's moving, it's interacting with the air,
Yeah.
heat, all that stuff.
Precisely. It seems stable to us because of the time scale and the level we're observing it at, but it's never truly static. It's more like a whirlpool. It has a form, but it's made of constant movement.
That definitely shifts how you think about it.
Mm.
Does the book give examples?
It does. It uses examples we easily recognize as processes, like a tree growing, absorbing sunlight and
Right.
water.
Well, that's obviously a process.
But then it applies the same thinking to things we don't usually see that way, like a rock being weathered down by the elements. That's not just something happening to the rock. The rock is that process of interaction and slow transformation. Or even an electron. It's not just a tiny ball sitting there. It's constantly shifting states, interacting with fields. It's better understood as an ongoing event, a process.
Sounds like it connects to that really interesting quote they have about the Puppet King, the red and blue spaces.
Absolutely. That analogy is key to understanding their view of reality and perception. Let me see if I have it here.
Yeah.
Wrapped inside its own red veil, all one can experience is a red space of their own making.
Okay.
Each puppet spends its days alone in a diurnal abstract reality that does not otherwise exist, blindfolded to the blue space that is actually shared.
Blindfolded to the blue space. So what are these spaces?
So the red space, in their terms, is your individual subjective experience.
Right.
Your thoughts, your feelings, your perceptions, memories, your entire inner world.
My reality as I experience it.
Exactly. But the key point is they argue it's a constructed reality, an interpretation. It feels complete, but it's made by you, within you.
And the blue space.
The blue space is where the actual processes, the fundamental interactions are happening. They call it the shared causation domain. It's the underlying stuff of reality, constantly in flux.
So the blue space is the process, and my red space is my take on it, my interpretation.
That's a great way to put it. We're blindfolded to the raw reality of the blue space. We don't experience those fundamental interactions directly. What we experience is our red space interpretation of the effects of those interactions.
So when I touch this table, the feeling of solidity, the texture, that's red space interpretation.
Correct. Generated in response to signals triggered by interactions happening in the blue space between, say, your hand and the table process.
Okay, this leads to their distinction between causation and interpretation, right?
Yes, exactly. Causation unfolds in the blue space. It's how these fundamental processes interact and influence each other, following their own inherent dynamics.
Like physics, basically. The laws governing interactions.
Sort of, but maybe even more fundamental than how we typically frame physics. And interpretation happens in a red space. It's how a particular process like you or me responds to those causal inputs and generates meaning, generates an experience.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Imagine a sudden loud noise that's a causal process propagating in the blue space. In my red space, I might interpret it as danger and jump. In your red space, maybe you recognize it as a car backfiring and dismiss it. Same cause, different interpretations.
And they talk about these domains being orthogonal. What does that mean? Like perpendicular?
Yeah, kind of like axes on a graph. They intersect, but they don't merge. Blue space causation proceeds on its own terms, regardless of how anyone interprets it. Red space interpretation arises because of causation, but it operates under its own rules, its own internal logic of making sense.
But they depend on each other.
Totally interdependent. You can't have interpretation without some causal interaction happening in the blue space to, give you something to interpret.
Right.
And from our perspective, the world as we know it, with meaning and objects and experiences, only really exists because of interpretation within red spaces. Reality, as we experience it, happens at that intersection.
Which makes sense of why they say sense perception is indirect. It's a transform.
Exactly. We're not getting a direct data feed from the blue space. A causal event happens, it generates signals, and our mind, our red space, transforms those signals into a useful interpretation. Sight, sound, touch. These are interpretations, not direct access.
And this isn't just passive, right? There's a loop.
Right. That interpretation in your red space can then lead to behavior and action. You react, you move, you speak, and that action becomes a new causal process entering back into the blue space, potentially affecting other processes.
Okay, so just to make sure I've got this, red space is my subjective experience, including what feels like the objective world to me, and blue space is the underlying shared domain of pure interaction and process.
You've nailed it. That's the core distinction.
How does this compare to how we usually think about things, like subjective versus objective?
Well, it kind of dissolves that sharp line, doesn't it? Usually we think objective reality is out there and subjective experience is in here. This model suggests that what we call objective reality is still an interpretation, albeit one that's often highly consistent and shared because we're all interacting with the same blue space processes.
It sounds a bit like Plato's cave or even the Matrix. Are they saying something similar?
There are definitely parallels in the sense of questioning the reality of our perceptions, but the Abstractionists' papers offers a slightly different picture. Instead of one shared illusion like in the Matrix, it's more like many parallel, individual interpretations, countless red spaces, all interacting with a common underlying causal domain, the blue space. It's not one fake reality, but many constructed realities grounded in a shared deeper reality.
So what's really the new thing here? What does this perspective actually do for us, thinking of everything as process?
I think the biggest novelty is separating causation so cleanly from interpretation. And a major benefit they propose is that this can help resolve certain paradoxes, the ones that seem to pop up when our interpretations clash with how things seem to work.
Like the chicken and egg.
Exactly. That paradox arises from thinking linearly about things which discrete object came first. But if you see it as an evolving process, a developmental cycle with feedback, the question of a single first thing kind of dissolves. The cycle is the reality.
And the ship of Theseus, too.
Same idea. The paradox, when does it stop being the same ship, comes from assuming identity is tied to a fixed collection of parts, a thing. If you see the ship as an ongoing process of maintenance, function, and history, the question changes. The contradiction, the book argues, isn't usually in the blue space, in the actual interactions. It's in our red space, in our concepts and assumptions about identity, objects, and time.
That might connect to why things sometimes feel fragile internally, even when the world outside seems solid. Our interpretations maybe struggle with the constant flux.
That's a really interesting thought. Maybe our models, our red space constructs, just aren't fully equipped to handle the sheer dynamism of the blue space.
So does this mean we need to throw out, like, physics or biology? Does it change science?
Not necessarily change the findings of science. It's more about offering a different philosophical framework, a new way to understand what science is doing. It suggests that maybe the natural spaces science describes, physical, biological, cognitive, are our best interpretive models of the blue space dynamics rather than direct descriptions of the fundamental reality itself.
They're like incredibly useful maps generated within our red spaces.
That's a good analogy. Maps of the blue space territory, constructed using the tools and logic available within our red spaces.
Okay, one last major piece seems to be the role of light. They don't just mean visible light, right?
Right. They use light in a much broader, more fundamental sense. It's presented as the basic mechanism for causal propagation itself. The way interactions spread and influence happens through this light.
So it's not just something traveling in space and time.
It's almost the other way around. Light, in this view, kind of defines the conditions for interaction, defines the space and time in which causation can occur. It's the medium of the blue space, if you like.
Wow. And they link this to electric and magnetic fields.
Yeah, there's a fascinating connection they draw. The electric field is linked more to interpretation, how an interaction registers, how its effects are felt within a process. And the magnetic field is linked to propagation, how the influence continues, how the process maintains its coherence or effect over time.
And wave-particle duality, how does that fit?
This framework offers an interesting angle. Maybe the wave aspect relates to the continuous propagation of influence in the blue space, the underlying causal flow, and the particle aspect relates to how that influence registers discretely when it interacts with an interpretive system, when it's measured or observed within a red space.
So continuous process in the blue, discrete event in the red.
That seems to be the idea they're putting forward. Light as the fundamental process enabling interaction, manifesting differently, depending on whether you're looking at the underlying flow or the interpreted impact.
Okay, this has been a lot to chew on. Really fascinating.
It definitely is. So, key takeaways. Everything's fundamentally process. Our experience is an interpretation, a red space view blindfolded to the underlying blue space of pure causation. Causation and interpretation are distinct, but totally interdependent.
Right, and light is the engine of that causation. And this whole perspective might help untangle paradoxes by showing they often live in our interpretation, not reality itself.
Exactly. It's a shift in perspective, not necessarily a change in scientific data, but maybe a profound change in how we understand that data and our place in the cosmos.
So for you listening, here's something to think about. What changes for you if you start seeing the world, and even yourself, not primarily as collections of static things, but as ongoing dynamic processes? How does that shift your understanding, your interactions?
It's a powerful question to sit with.
Definitely. And if you want to dive deeper into all this, remember the source, The Abstractionist's Papers by Luiz von Paumgartten, free at welcometothe bluespace.com.